Everybody, can you guys in the back hear me, or should I put the microphone on? Okay, I'll do the mic on. This is better. Yeah. Okay. Good. Cool. Um, this session today is about creating applications for not the desktop. So it's creating applications for web and mobile, and I'm going to use Blazor, which is a technology for Microsoft, and I'm going to show some FoxPro code running in this environment. And to do that, we need XSharp because FoxPro itself is absolutely not capable of integrating in these environments. Okay, why, of course, is the first. I didn't put a slide in there with Robert because I assume you guys know who I am. If not, ask me afterwards in the Q&A. Why are we doing this? Well, I assume that many of you have clients, like I have, that want to expose some of their business in the web or on mobile devices. And if you're coming from an X-based background, Fox Pro in your case, in my case it was another X-based language, we don't have those capabilities built into our software. So we need to look at something else, and that's why we want to check today one of the opportunities of what Microsoft has given us. Okay, I'm also going to discuss a bit about what is Blazor, how does it work. Blazor comes in different variations, and I'm going to show you how you can call X-base code or FoxPro code from a Blazor app and how you can run it in the different environments. So with different environments, I mean uh, on a application running from a server, an application running in the browser at the client machine, or an application running on a mobile device such as an Android a phone or an Android tablet, iPhone, Apple tablet, etc. Okay, biggest reason why is I think the world is changing. We're no longer running apps on our desktop. So your customers expect you to run apps on mobile devices, and they have no idea how complicated that is because it's such a different beast. And the simple thing is why, for example, how do you come to data? Well, static data like product codes, although that's probably also not static, but let's say client categories, you can probably put on those devices. But anything that's dynamic, you do not want to put on those devices. You want to get from the web one way or the other to show them the current list of, let's say, open invoices or the current list of products. So world is changing and we need to somehow expose our data in this new environment. And that is why we're looking at this. And it also requires a new approach because the form factor is different. There's no longer a huge screen, but these screens can be very small, which means, for example, that if you open an interface, you cannot show the complete menu, but you have to uh, shut, uh, compress the menu and only open it through a button. But of course, since we all have invested many years in code, we want to be able to use at least some of our code. So if there's logic in our application, for example, to validate user entry, we do not want to write that again because rewriting means introducing new bugs. It's already complicated enough to handle the current bugs that we know about. So if we can use existing logic, um, we have both the advantage that we do not lose time to write the logic again, and we do not introduce new bugs. Now, I will not be doing huge, complicated validation algorithms, but I'm going to show you the technique how you can bring your code in an environment that runs on those devices. Okay, what is Blazor? Um, Blazor is a technology that Microsoft introduced around the year 2020, and it is part of what they call ASP.NET, and more in particular ASP.NET Core. And with Blazor, you can create apps that render themselves in the browser with HTML and CSS. And they also have JavaScript behind it. And Blazor itself is like a combination of different technologies. It uses Razor, which is a technology to describe web pages, and has the ability to inline code. And inline code, not just as you would expect in a web browser JavaScript code, but you can also inline C# code. And in those pages, you can mix both UI elements and code. And this allows you to easily, for example, create tables because you can put the table in a header in there and then for each to a list of items and output these item values into the cells. We're going to see that running. Blazor also supports both embedded code in a Razor page, but you can also have normal code files. And in the Blazor project, those normal code files are C# files. So what we're going to look now, I'm going to create a new one. It's a web server app. But before I do that, this is not in the paper, but I realized that it may not be obvious if you start Visual Studio. It's very well possible that you don't see Blazor at all, because Visual Studio nowadays allows you to choose what they call workloads. And Blazor is part of a workload. And if you do not pick this workload in the installer, you don't get it. So I'm running now in the background. Where is it? There should be here is Visual Studio installer. My apologies for the font, but the Visual Studio installer doesn't allow you to change the font. As you can see, I have several versions of Visual Studio, probably way too many. But we are testing our stuff in different versions, so that's why I have different versions. And let's go to the current release, Visual Studio Enterprise. And if you install, you get this dialog. And this dialog shows you the different workloads that you have to choose, that you can choose for Visual Studio. The important one, if you want to do web development, is ASP.NET and web development. The name already says it. If you plan to do only desktop development, you don't need this. If you want to deploy your app later to Azure, as you can imagine, you take Azure. I'm not doing it right now in the session, but it will add extra components. If you want to do development on mobile devices, you have to pick .NET Multi-Platform App UI development. And the MAUI is also the abbreviation of what they call mobile apps. This was used to be called Xamarin in the past. Microsoft acquired Xamarin, which was another company, and they integrated into their complete suite of products. So this you need to check, otherwise the option to create a Blazor application for mobile will not be there. This installs several templates, but it also installs Visual Studio components that allow you, for example, to run an Android device manager and to deploy your apps to virtual Android phones, which is much easier, of course, than having to deploy them to physical phones. So these options must be selected. On top of that, you can choose individual components. And depending on the version of Visual Studio, you will have more or less versions of .NET here. This version is the current release version of Visual Studio, and it goes to .NET 7. But if you would use the Visual Studio Preview, which you also can download, you can also install .NET 8. .NET 8 will be released next month. There's a .NET event, and that's also the moment they will release .NET 8. And .NET 8 will come with new features for Blazor. I'm not going to cover these new features in the session. I'm not going to demonstrate them at least, but when you're interested, I can tell you more about that later. So if you don't see Blazor in your Visual Studio, go to the installer and pick the proper workloads. Otherwise, you will have no idea what to do. Okay, let's remove this because my Visual Studio does have Blazor. Let's close this solution. And so assume you want to do a new Blazor project. What you do is you go to this start window where you can see the current app of the recent apps and the buttons to choose a new app. It looks terrible now because of the large font, but at least you can all read it in the back as well. When you create a new project in Visual Studio, I don't like this particular dialog, but they didn't ask me what my opinion was. So actually, I did give my opinion, and many developers did, but they decided this was the best UI for new projects. I think it's confusing. Anyway, I'm interested in Blazor now. So what I can do here is I can choose the development language, the platforms, or project types. And now I'm going to choose Blazor here as a project type. And then Visual Studio shows me all the templates that they have for Blazor apps. And I'm going to start with Blazor Server app. The words that you see on the bottom here are the keywords that are also in the other combos. So if you would have picked Linux or Linux, you would have seen all Linux templates, and this one would be included. Okay, choose this one. And under the next button, I have a few options. Um, I'm going to click something right now. This is not the sample that you have on the conference material because I made some changes, but I'm going to make those changes on the fly here now. But in case if I make mistakes, we can always go back to the one that's working, and that's part of what you get with the conference materials. So this is relatively simple. We give it a name. An option that you can choose from is whether you want to place the project and the solution in the same directory. Depending on what you do, if you have a single project, it's usually a good idea because it saves you one level extra in the directory hierarchy. But if you plan to add multiple projects in a solution, you're better off by putting the solution in the parent folder and then the different project that you will put in that solution in child folders under the solution folder. So that's the question of design. Right now, I want to do just a single project, so I put them in the same folder. This has nothing to do with Blazor, by the way. This is normal Visual Studio, but for most of you, this will be hostile foreign territory. So, okay. The next one, we can choose the version of the framework. The version that you choose here is not, if you make a mistake here, you can always change it to another version later, but this is your initial version. You have to tell it what authentication to use. I'm using none because this is demo. And you can do a complete session or probably a whole day of sessions about authentication. I have little idea about how that works. I don't want to know. There's other experts who know that. So, but I leave it for none. But this is not what you deploy. So don't tell Robert says we do not know. You cannot deploy with none. You have to choose one of these methods, identity platform, whatever, but don't deploy with none. This is a good idea probably. You want to configure for HTTPS, which means that it runs secure. It does have effects, we will see later, because it'll self-generate a certificate, and depending on the browser that you have, the browser will or will not complain about self-signed certificates. You'll see that. Enable Docker, I'm going to skip that for now, but the short story behind this, you can deploy this as a folder of files to an existing web server, or you can deploy a Blazor app into a Docker image, which is basically like a kind of a virtual machine that you deploy on the server, and it will be a self-hosted complete environment then. That's really convenient, especially if you want to deploy, for example, to Azure. You can push the complete Docker file to Azure, and then everything is there. So you know that all the components are there. You don't have to worry about whether there's IIS running on the machine or whatever platform you use to deploy your app. I'm not going to do it. And the last one, do not use top-level statements. I do that because I prefer that. But there's an option in C# for the main app whether it needs to have, let's say, a function at the start of the first line, as you would have in FoxPro, or the first line can be immediately a statement like a parameters or L parameters. Not that C# has parameters or L parameters, but you get the idea. So if you leave this off, then it will start immediately with code, and otherwise it's going to wrap it in a namespace and a class, etc. I prefer that, but that's a matter of taste. So I'm not using top-level statements. It's new, and I probably want to show off that they have added this to the language. So that's the default, is that they will use top-level statements. Okay, long story short, this thing is going to do something, and it's going to give me a page with some reading materials, etc. I'll skip that for now. On the right-hand side, you see the structure of this Blazor application. And what you will see is there's a program.cs file, which is basically the start of the application. This contains a function with the name main, which is the normal entry point for every C# application. So the Blazor application is a C# application. It gets compiled into a C# compiled assembly. Of course, since it's the web application, it also has to have other stuff, but this is the entry point. For simplicity, I'm not going to explain everything that happens here because, again, you can have many days to talk about this. I want to give you a rough idea of the structure of the app and then show you later how you can um, modify it. Let's run it first to get an idea, and then we're going to look at the various components of the app and how they've organized things. To run it in Visual Studio, we will simply press this button, or we do debug, start debugging, or we can simply build, but then again, you have to run it. So I'll just press um, this button or F5. That's just like with what you saw in the tour session with all the shortcuts and menu choices. We have the same over here. And what you saw a terminal window flash, and what's happening is in the background. I was said in the background, but I want to see it in the foreground. It starts a process called Blazor App 5exe. This is basically the application running in a console window. This application exposes functionality over IP to the browser, and the app itself is of course running in the browser. So it also brought up my browser, and this is what I want for. So I have an HTTPS application with a self-signed certificate. My Firefox doesn't like that because I set it to strict. I want to make sure that when someone puts a certificate on a website, that at least there's an authority who says, yeah, you can trust this guy. So in this case, it doesn't trust my computer, which is probably a good idea because you never know who has played with your computer. Anyway, for now, I'm going to choose advanced and I'm going to accept the risk and continue. And there is our first Blazor app. This is the Blazor template that we'll see throughout the session. I'm not a GUI designer, so I'm not gonna make it fancy and change the background to blue and do all kind of stuff. I can probably increase the font, but that's about where I can go with my web UI experience. We have other people who can do that. What I want to show you is how it works. Now what we see is a starting page, and we see a page with a counter and a button. And as you click the button, I can. It's probably better for the people in the back and the people at home. It increases the count, so something is happening there. We will look into that, what's happening later. And I can press fetch data, which is going to get some data. This data is random, so if I refresh the page, you're going to see the temperatures are going crazy. There's something in the background that generates random data. So the idea of this thing is to demonstrate that you can call back and fetch data. It could just be the current list of open invoices or anything else. If there's something where you press in the UI and it changes something, which updates the UI, and the home menu is simply a static page. If you change the size of this app, you will see that this is what's called a responsive UI. So the menu disappears and something's happening in the back. I'm not sure. I think they use Bootstrap. Again, I have no idea and I don't want to know. It's complicated enough to keep our website running, and it also uses Bootstrap, and I have problems getting things on the right place, with the right size. And when I need help, I call someone who knows how to do these things. Anyway, this is what the front end of the app looks like. Now let's have a look at the back end. So we saw 3 pages. They have common UI. So the layout is there's a menu on the left, and if you shrink the size, we get a hamburger menu, which is like the pop-up menu. And if you choose another thing, and what you see on the top is that the URL changes. So it says localhost. This is basically the port number where this background process is running on. And you will see that it goes to a counter page or a fetch data page. So let's look what's behind these pages. So to do so, I'm going to close it, and then I'm going to close the server running. Okay, we're going to also close this page, and let's go and look at some code. So the menu says there's shared. The shared menu contains stuff that is shared, like the name implies, between the pages. So it has a main layout, which is contains some HTML code, but not just HTML code. As you can see, it also has words here that start with an @ sign or @ character. And the add character basically says, this is C sharp. So it escapes. It makes the difference between what's going to be rendered in the browser and what's going to be compiled into C sharp. So this basically says that the C sharp tells it that this page inherits from a base class, layout component base. And so there will be a class generated from this that inherits from layout component base. If you are one of those persons who likes to subclass things, this is where you can put your own subclass. So you could have my layout component base and have the whole hierarchy inherit from your layout. You see a token here called nav menu, which refers to the nav menu razor page, and there's a body. And this is basically the placeholder for all the pages that we saw. So the counter page and the fetch data page. The nav menu is a piece of code that has links to the different menu items. And these words are, as you can see, are basically references to classes. So there's a nav link class in ASP.NET Core component routing, and this tells us that where to go to. So this link goes to the href empty, which is the root basically. And this one goes to the counter that we saw on the URL, so localhost port number / counter, and this one goes to fetch data. So if we add pages in this menu, of course you're not forced to use this menu, but the sample uses it, then you add new divs for the page. You probably choose another icon. This is a plus icon, this is a rich icon. There's the documentation about this that shows you all the possible icons, there's many. And you can choose other layout stuff, which are a little bit out of the scope of today. There's also a survey prompt, which is referenced into the index page, which basically goes to an outside web where they put that. But this is the text that they're showing. Oh yeah, there's the link for Microsoft forward link, etc. So what about the contents? Because that's the most interesting part. Now there are three razor pages here that are interesting. Index is the first one, which basically refers to this survey prompt component. So this particular XML node refers to another razor file. And there's a counter page, and this becomes a bit more interesting. So in the counter page, you can see that it declares a name of the page. So this is basically the class name that it specifies. Blazor apps will generate classes, and the classes will be part of this exe. So this tells the system we're going to generate a class called counter, which is basically from the root of the website. That's why it starts with a slash. Then we have some UI elements like page title, which probably refers to something else because of the color in the editor. And we have a normal paragraph, but in the normal paragraph you see an add current count. So this again is C#. This refers, as you can see in the editor, to the private int current count. And there's also a bit of code here, increment count, and as you can see here, the button has an on-click event. Sound familiar, right? FoxPro people also have click events, on-click, it's just a few characters different, and this links to the increment count. So just let's look what happens if we do this. So I'm going to run it again, but now I'm interested in debugging, so I'm going to set a breakpoint, and let's hope that it works. And yeah, I press F9, and we see the breakpoint appear. So let's run this. Probably, hopefully, the certificate hasn't changed, and my browser doesn't complain. It doesn't, I know. And now if we go into the counter page, you can see my Visual Studio blinking on the bottom. So we are now inside the C# code. So what's happening is that we have an application running on the server which exposes a page. And the page is a class. You can see here in the locals window, there's a variable called this, familiar to you guys, right? And it's of type Blazor app 5, the name of my app, pages counter. So this is an object The complete page is available as an object, and one of the properties in this object is current count. Well, actually, it's not a property; it's a field. I don't think you guys in FoxPro make a difference between fields and properties. In C# or in .NET, there is a big difference, but this is a field, so there's no getter and setter involved. It's just something you write to. And when the page gets initialized, all the fields that are declared inside the code section are available and have, in this case, are initialized. So that's why we enter here. We haven't seen the page yet in the UI. The UI is still waiting. It's trying to reconnect because Robert is taking too long to finish this code. Let's run. Hopefully it doesn't. At home, you don't talk that much when you do this. But it works. Okay, there's the page. Current count is 0. The current count was read here. So let's see what happens if I press the button. So I'm going to go here, hit a breakpoint. And now, this button could be on a client running in a web browser in New York, right? So New York presses the button, and let's assume this server runs in Dallas, Texas. And then the server in Dallas, Texas, that's the location where this application is running. Gets a message back from the browser that the button was clicked. So now we're back here in the browser. I have on purpose shown what they call external code. In Visual Studio, you have an option in the debugger to show just your code. Or I think it's just my code. But I have disabled that so you have a bit of an idea what has happened before we entered in this code. If you want to focus on just your own code, you can do this. I'll do it now. And then you see the call stack only mentions external code. That's code that is in an assembly that was included in your application. So from the browser in New York, we're now at the server in Dallas, Texas, and it gets a message. The mechanism that is used to communicate from the browser to the server uses a protocol or a principle that's called SignalR, which basically there's a JavaScript running in the browser. We can look at that if we want, and it sends a signal to the server with SignalR. That's why I call it the signal that it sends. Button was clicked, and then the server can respond. And in this case, the server increments the current count. And now I'm stepping through with F11, and as you could see, there's somehow a mechanism built in that when the value of current count changes, then the control, in this case the paragraph, but the paragraph is also control in the terms of Blazor, needs to be updated. So it's going to update the text, basically the HTML inner text of this paragraph, and then I'm stepping out, and on the page we see 1 appear. Now, if you would have monitored the stuff in the back, you will see that compared with traditional ASP.NET, the complete page would often be completely refreshed. But in this case, there's a smart mechanism in the back that just updates the section of the page that was updated. So you don't see refreshes, and it's also much faster than having to rebuild the complete document model. So it updates the DOM and inserts the code, the updated text in the DOM. And this works for all major browsers. There's what part of the new browser, I would say, technology is that all the vendors have sit together and have implemented some things so they can update this without having to refresh the page. And that also makes running apps in the browser viable, because refreshing the complete page, that's a disaster. Now let's have a look at fetch data to see what happens there. So I'm going to go to my Solution Explorer and to the fetch data page. How am I doing on time? 30 minutes. Okay, yeah. Okay, so fetch data also has code, and it has this thing. Let's put a break here. So now somehow it gets data. And there is what they call a forecast service. Usually on the web, applications talk with each other with other web services that expose data. Or what you could do, what we'll do later in the sample, is the server has access to a SQL database and fetches data from there. In this case, they have created something called a weather service, which is part of this solution. In the data folder, there's a weather forecast service. This is the file that we're in right now. And this service just uses some random numbers to generate random temperatures and returns that as a task of weather forecast, a task that contains a weather forecast array. But this is a bit of complicated stuff. This is a asynchronous method. And asynchronous methods are expected to return a task of something. These less than, greater than characters we usually pronounce as of. So a task is an object that contains something, and you specify in this case that the object inside the task is a weather forecast array. So it's a task of weather forecast array. Um, it will take a while before this sinks in. I know it took a while before me to sink it in. And what it is an asynchronous method. That means that while we are executing, the rest of the app still continues to keep things snappy, that the application doesn't wait basically. So, but on here it waits, yeah, okay, because we were in the initializer of the page. Let's exit. Then we see the results. Now this may take a while. I was in the debugger, so it took a while anyway because I was stopping it. But if you look at the page itself, it actually has here code that says if forecast is null, so the forecast data has not been retrieved yet, it's going to show you loading. So the page is already there, and then by the time the forecast data is loaded, then this code will run, and then the page with the complete HTML table will be sent to the client. Again, will be inserted in the already visible document model. So if it takes a while before the list of open orders is loaded, that's not a problem because the customer already gets a page which says loading, and for the customer it feels that it's running fast. The page appears fast, and it doesn't have to wait until everything is loaded. Because I'm using the debugger, I'm just ruining all of that. So, but the design is, and it's a general design. If you have something that may take a while, you call asynchronous code, and the asynchronous code will execute probably on a separate thread. Doesn't have to be, it just runs. But the application can continue, and the customer already gets the information that the page is loading, and then when the data is ready, the page will be updated and the data will be shown. The other objects in this thing, which we'll see in the other samples too, there's a weather forecast object. This is a C# object that contains the dates and the temperatures, etc. As you can see, this app was apparently designed by someone who uses metric and who uses Celsius, and the Fahrenheit is derived, so there's no two fields. This is the syntax for a property that only has a getter, and this equals greater than means that if whenever someone asks for the temperature in Fahrenheit, use this formula. I never knew it was 5556. I always did divided by 2, or divided by a half, or multiply by 2, and then 32. But apparently this is the right formula. I hope. But of course it's Microsoft, so you never know. And a summary, this syntax means that the summary can be null. It's a nullable string. And the other ones are what we call value types. So they always have a value. So if you create a new weather forecast object, there will be an empty date, zero temperature, a zero F, because it's calculated. Well, actually, it will not be 0, it will be 32 Fahrenheit in an empty object. And the summary can be null. And the weather forecast service is what is called to fetch the data. So this basically does some random things. Let me look at my notes where I am, because the risk is always that I go ahead and tell too much. Okay. This structure it's called Blazor server. So the complete application runs on the server, and the web browser only gets HTML and gets JavaScript. So to prove is probably not the right word, you can of course inspect the web page, open the stuff, and then in the debugger you can see stuff, and this has some scripts in here and has some other stuff that get pushed. And there's a component called ASP.NET Core Browser Refresh, which is basically contains a lot of code. It's not our code; it's part of Blazor, and it is used to refresh elements in the browser. So this is smart enough to know not to refresh the whole page. Are there any questions about this so far? Maybe online? No? Okay. Is this interesting or boring? Because then we can also do something else. Okay, I think let's assume that you guys think this is interesting, but we haven't seen FoxPro code yet. I will show you a few other samples of Blazor before we go to the FoxPro code. We have more than half, or almost three-quarter left, so we have time for that. Okay, let's do the second one, the second new app. I'm going to go to the new project dialog again, but now I'm going to use Blazor WebAssembly. So the first example, everything was running on the server, but sometimes it's convenient to have also stuff running on the client. You may want to pre-validate data before it gets sent to the server, so it saves a round trip. Of course, you cannot do all the validation there. You cannot validate, for example, if the credit level of the customer is enough, but you could validate if they have entered first name and last name. So in that case, you may want to put some logic on the client so that it saves you less round trips on the server and your server will be not as busy. That's where Blazor WebAssembly can be used. Okay, we have similar questions. I'm going to place it again in the same folder. Now I have, again, this is again the .NET Framework, authentication, the same story, HTTPS, the same story, but I have a new option here called ASP.NET Core Hosted. I'm going to start with that. And what it means is what we'll also see, that it doesn't just create a WebAssembly app, but it also creates a web server app. So it'll put some logic on the server and some logic in the client. And in this case, I know is that the real stuff on the server is the code that generates the weather data. So that's handled on the server. But for example, the counter is handled on the client. Let's run this and then set some breakpoints. So in the pages here, you see no counter, but you see a controller. It's called the weather forecast controller. So this is what's called to get the data, and especially this method. So I'm setting a breakpoint here. Then we have the client. It has a counter page. Let's just check the button. It has a fetch data, and in this fetch data, it's going to call this method to fetch the weather. Debug it. Gives me some time. The UI of the app, it will not surprise you, is the same. You will see again a background process here. This is again the app server. Since this is a new app and I still run Firefox, I'm getting the warning. But what you see now, it was different from the previous. You saw loading. What happens? This is an app that is running on the client. So something gets loaded in the client. And that something is the WebAssembly. So if you look in the client, you will see that there's now mono. So what happens with a WebAssembly is that a subset of .NET gets pushed to the client. Of course, if your application doesn't change, the next time you load the page, you will have the same subset. But if you do change the application, it may force it to load this WebAssembly which runs under .NET again to the client. And this runs in any normal browser. So it runs in um, Chrome, it runs in Firefox, it runs in Edge. So uh, basically, you're running .NET now on the client machine. And to prove that, um, let's go to the counter page first and click. And I had expected it to stop here, but something is going wrong. I probably have the debugger setting incorrect, but it doesn't stop here. I wanted to show you stopping it here. I'll investigate. I may have set an option in the debugger incorrect. Anyway, fetch data is now okay. So now fetch data. Somehow my client-side debugging doesn't work, but it should work. I had expected the client to stop also in the debugger, which is really tricky because then the New York client would send the debug signal to the debugger running in Texas. So this is probably unlikely, but on the development machine that should work. But right now, when I do fetch data, then the client needs to get the list of data. And in this particular sample, where there's a server component, the client sends a message through HTTP to the server, give me the data. So that's where it's called home, basically. It says, what is the current weather data? And that's where I have a breakpoint now. So we are in the server app. Because of the huge fonts, it's difficult to see. But you can see we're in Blazor app server DLL, which runs locally. And this generates the data and sends that data back to the client. Now, because I had a breakpoint, it gets timeout, but it gets the data now. So this particular example, the client calls home, says, give me the current weather, and the current weather gets sent to the client, and then the client processes that and puts it in the page. So there's a difference between the previous one is that we are running code in the browser now, and that code is C# code. So the code in the counter page, the code in the fetch data page, the only change that was made there is that the fetch data now doesn't fetch the data from a service running in the same process, but it uses a method um, that you can see here called HTTP get from JSON async, and it has a weather forecast array again and a weather forecast object. And this also explains, I didn't mention it before, but I said we have two projects, but we actually don't. We have three projects. They both share a common thing that defines the weather forecast class. So the same weather forecast class is now used both on the client and on the server. So the server sends JSON data, and the JSON data is serialized by the server into a JSON string. So you have an object and it gets serialized, and on the client side, the JSON gets deserialized into the same object. And since there's a shared project, we know that we compile the client against the same object model, so all the properties will match. You could, of course, include this on both sides, but then, well, Murphy would say it will happen that someone changes the structure on one but not on the other. So that's why they put common code, and in this case, the only common code is the weather forecast object. So this is shared by both. What else do I need to see about web? No, okay. In this case, also signal R is used, but the fetching the data in this sample is done through to JSON, but it could also have read data, let's say from an RSS feed on another side, or use REST API to fetch data and put it in the client. But this sample wants to show you that it uses JSON as a stream to send from the server to the client. And JSON is at the moment the most recommended thing to send. You could send XML, but XML is usually has the same data, but it's bigger. And you want to reduce, of course, what you use on the wires. You send as little data as possible, and JSON is by far the most common one. Technically, you could send binary data, but it's a bit difficult to debug. So that's why most people use JSON. I'm not going to go into all the details of this, just to give you an idea. We're running WebAssembly now. Let's do another one. Stop this. I think I forgot. Okay, so this one. Now I quit my complete Visual Studio, which is not a good idea. Um, the other one I'm going to quickly show you is um, a Blazor WebAssembly without a server. So on the next page, I will not choose ASP.NET Core hosted, and then we get just a single project. And of course, there is no service there that can give it the data because it's there. So it has to get the data from another process running on the web. It could be from Amazon or from Google or something you wrote yourself. This sample in the page actually does something different, which is also something you could do. It gets from a JSON async, just like before, but now it has uh, embedded data, which what you can do as well in your app. You can have some static data that you embed in here. Of course, this is now static, so the weather will always be the same. But that's okay. So you can see here in the, where is it stored? In the sample data folder, there's a weather JSON file, which gives some dates and temperatures. So let's run this, and then we'll go to the more fun part. Of course, I should have used another browser just to show you how that you can. In this menu, I can choose the web browser. Let's do Chrome now. And I can also put in, that's probably why my debugging didn't work, my script debugging is disabled, but I could also enable stuff like that. Let's use Chrome. And as you can see, Chrome, at least the last time I tested it, doesn't complain about security. Chrome doesn't care basically. Again, you see loading. So right now it's loading the WebAssembly in Chrome. So we have .NET running in Chrome. The page here is different, but you can see mono WebAssembly. The invalid doesn't mean that it's invalid. I think they've chosen an extension to make sure that Chrome wouldn't get confused and wouldn't try to do something with it. Anyway, this runs now as .NET in Chrome, and the rest is the same. So we fetch data, and as we saw, the data in this case is hard coded, but could of course come from any data sources, whatever you choose. So the third variation of Blazor now runs completely in the web browser. This is probably not what you'll do with hard-coded data, but it could be as a lookup mechanism for something. But in general, you would want to fetch your data from something online because you want to see current information, the current weather or whatever. But you would have to access to a weather service on the web. Now, Microsoft didn't do it in the sample because to make sure that if you had no web connection, it would still work. But this is the basic idea behind the app. Okay, the rest is almost the same as the other one, so I'm just going to ignore it. The more interesting part is when we want to move to mobile devices. So let's do another new app. And that's the multi-platform app UI. That was Maui. It's not the island on Hawaii, but it's probably not a coincidence that they picked this abbreviation. This allows me to create apps for different platforms. Now we have similar questions that we had before, and the app that it generates is structured a bit different than the ones we had before. There are common things in here, of course. What they do, I think they could do good is to give you all kind of hints where you can find more information because most people will have no idea where to start. So use this because there's a lot of information about this on the web. But inside the project, you will now see a new node called platforms. And in the platforms, you will see platform specific files. So the files in the Android folder will only be used if we deploy the app to Android. And the files in the iOS folder, well, I don't have to explain. Those who then the iOS apps will know that there's something called a plist, which is a property list. and it basically contains information. But the good thing is that if you click those files, you can actually, there are designers for this. So when Microsoft acquired Xamarin, Xamarin has already implemented lots of these things like designers for plists or things, and you can specify which orientation the device has, some other stuff. So you can basically specify a lot of stuff that you need. Also, for example, if you the Windows one will create what they call in Windows 8 was introduced, they call a modern app, which is like what you can get from. I didn't think it was modern, but that's the terminology they used. I think it was converting Windows into window um, because it was a single window app. But okay, and there's again designers here that allow you to specify the name and if you package, you have to specify who owner and the version, etc., the publisher, stuff that you need to publish in the Windows Store. So each of these platforms has their own rules, etc. Deploying it to an Android store or deploying it to the iOS store is again a subject for a complete conference because and you have to get the certain licenses and you have to pay Apple a lot of money to get your apps in there. And if you think your app is ready, well, they say, no, no, you don't decide if it's ready. We decide if it's ready. So there's a whole story behind it. It's out of the scope of the session, but be aware of it. So if you create your app now and you expect your customer to have it tomorrow, you can forget it. You have to go through the certification process and you have to probably digitally sign everything, and it is a lot of work. But what the focus here is the technology. And what you'll see is we have again a weather forecast service, and we have, in this case, it generates random numbers. We have the pages again, and it's no surprise that the pages look the same. There may be some different names in there, but in general, it is the same. So let's try to run this, and I'll run it on the Windows machine, and let's see if we can debug it. So I want to debug getting the forecasts, and I want to debug. I hope it works. The easiest one is the Windows machine because it doesn't need another box to run on. But that's why I start with Windows, and it'll create an app that runs on Windows. To do so, you have to enable an option in your system settings on your machine. You have to run in developer mode, so you're allowed as a developer to deploy in your own a modern UI application cache. Um, it is running. I'm not sure what it's doing. It will take a while before it comes. It needs to deploy it. But there you are. It's loading. So now we're running a modern UI application. Again, I don't think it's modern, but that's what they call it. And we can, it looks the same. And now I can debug it. So you can see, actually, we see the XAML live preview. Again, that's out of the scope of this session. We have the property explorer, but you can see because the application is built with XAML. You can look into the UI elements, set up properties and stuff. Uh, nice work, really important. But I personally don't care about that. I'm interested in the technology behind. But you see now this Windows app is running, and we can debugger. We can follow what's happening. Get rid of this breakpoint, and it does do what you expect. And the fetch data calls the service and shows the data. Again, this is now not static data. This is live. There's code behind that generates random numbers, and that's why we see this table with dates from tomorrow and later. The cool thing is that it runs also on other platforms. That's what you want, of course. Now there is platform-specific stuff, like I said, in the platforms folder, but a lot is common. So let's try to run this on Android. I have two Android emulators. I'm choosing the second one, and if you run, you will see that there's also a Android device manager installed. That's part of what we inherited from Xamarin. So that we have Android device manager. It allows me to see all my Android devices. And of course, you want to make sure that your Android device that you're using is running. So this one is not running yet, so I'm going to start it. The debugger would start it too, but I wanted to show you the device manager. It's there, it's in the menu. And you can see now my Android device is running. Actually, it's not, but it is black. So it's like your phone who is switched off. But there's an on-off button here, and that should start it. So we should see the, hopefully, fingers crossed, we should see the Android device. Not? Come on, don't do this to me. Okay, let's run this in the background. The output window in Visual Studio, by the way, can be really useful. It says it cannot start it. Ah, it is started. All right, now we see Google appearing. This is the real Android running there, right? So with all the good and bad things about Android and Google trying to get information from us, all that stuff is just what you have with a normal Android. So the first time you run it, they ask you, "Oh, what's your Google username?" Because you want to make it convenient for you, so you feel at home. So I would recommend use a test user for Google for that. So don't put your real email stuff in there. It doesn't make sense. But it is running, and in the back now we see in the window that it's actually my machine. By the way, is 3 years old, so that's why it takes a bit. And it wasn't the most expensive one when I bought it, but it is starting. And if you do these things, get the latest and greatest hardware. And with my machine has a lot of memory. I have 32 gig, but to run this takes a bit of time. Uh, Come on. No, this is too bad. I'm not going to wait for this. It does run, but for some reason today it doesn't want to. One more try, and then maybe the timing was incorrect. It's still progress bar here. It's no, forget this. No, no, not at all. It's the compiled code needs to be deployed to the device, and the device has to say yes, I'm ready. Apparently, Google is maybe updating the BIOS or whatever firmware. I have no idea, but it is busy, but not with the stuff that I wanted to be busy with. So, because of the time, we have 15 minutes left. I want to skip this because the most interesting part is, of course, to run your own code there. So I'm going back to my um, first app. So what if you wanted to run your own code there? Now, like I said, FoxPro doesn't run here. This runs .NET in 64-bit mode on the server. You can forget about Fox. You cannot deploy your COM component, 32-bit COM component. That simply will not run. So you need something else that produces .NET. Now, if you want to use a familiar language, then and that's not because we made it, but yeah, you need something that looks like FoxPro, and that's XSharp. That's the only one. Of course, you can do it in C#, but I want to give you an example of how it would look in stuff. So what I want to do now is add a new project here. But um, in the handout, I'm putting a new project in a separate folder so I can use it from the different assemblies. But since we're running out of time, I want to do it in here. I'm not going to reuse it in the WebAssembly, but I'm going to show you the same code running in the WebAssembly by opening the prepared project that's part of your download. So I'm doing a new project here now. I'm not going to do Blazor, but I'm going to choose XSharp. And I'm going to use um, Visual FoxPro. And then what I want to do here is not an application because I want to use a component basically, and that's what we call a class library. So I generate a Visual FoxPro class library, and for simplicity, it generates this file with a class, etc. This is the defined class as you know in FoxPro. I'm going to throw this all away. I don't want it. I wanted to keep it simple first. So what I want to do is in this um, data page where we get the weather, I want to change some information there. So see if we get cold and if we can manipulate the information. So what I'm going to do is something, and it's absolutely ridiculous because you could do this in C# too. we're going to create a function myUpper, and I'm going to give it the text as string, as string. I'm going to return, come on. As you can see, the tooltip appears that this is a function built into the XSharp runtime. There's no upper in C#, there's no upper in .NET. There is a toUpper in the string class, and guess what the upper function is doing? Well, it does two things. It checks for null, because if it's null, it doesn't crash, where the toUpper will crash if the string is null, and it will then call up toUpper on the string if it is not null. So, but the idea is we want to see what happens. Can we call this? So I'm going to build this, Shift F6 on my machine. And I'm going to tell the Blazor app, I want a project reference. I want to include this class library in the application. Now the class library is called class library 9. That's important because in .NET, classes are in a namespace, because there are more than one control class exists. There's a control in Windows Forms, there's a control in WPF, there's a control in ASP.NET. To make sure that you can be explicit about which control class you want, you have to specify the namespace. It's a bit like your as type in component. Namespaces are the component name, basically. So in this case, I didn't do anything, but the library is called class library 9, and I have a function, and it is part of the class library 9 namespace. So I'm going into my pages now. I'm going to the fetch data page, and I'm going to tell it, okay, I want to use class library 9. Come on, why is it not showing? It should show me the list. Ah, there it is. It took a while for the IntelliSense to pick it up. So because I added the dependency, the C# background code inspected our assembly, the DLL that we produced, and found a namespace called class library name. So it doesn't have to be the same name as the file. You can have more than one namespace in a file, or you can have the same namespace in multiple files. So there is no one-to-one relation. But so it inspected the file, found the class library 9, and then what I want is I want to uppercase the summary to show that we can. Now the summary is a function, and .NET everything is classes. So what class name do you think the functions are in? What would you have chosen? Well, we have chosen functions because we thought it made sense, at least to people who speak English. So I can do functions dot, and as you see, we have not just myUpper, we also have equals and reference equals. That's because in .NET, all classes inherit from system.object, and those two methods are part of system.object. So that's why we also see them. For the function class, it doesn't really make sense to call equals or reference equals, because this is what we call a static class. So you will never create an object of type functions, but it exposes functions that have no this property, basically. So that's why you don't use equals or reference equals. Anyway, that's sidestep. If everything goes well, fingers crossed, build is succeeded, we go to our class 1 PRG, we set a breakpoint. Come on. And run. Again, this runs on the server now. So we're running this code on the server, and from the page, it calls into the C# background code, because there was an ad saying that it needed to show the summary of this thing. And now we get the service. Come on. And as you can see, we're now in the XSharp code. And it gets here a few times because you see the text coming in, it's cool, etc. It's all camel case, but the result is uppercase. So the Blazor page with the C# calls it to our assembly, and it works. And we can even debug it. So I think that's cool, because The upper function is absolutely stupid, but it could be any function that you run there. And we could do the counter page, we could do evaluate that we only return odd numbers or even numbers or whatever we want to do. So what I want to show you, the technology exists to call your code. Now I have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to fast forward. The paper describes everything. I'm going to open a prepared solution that is part of the download. Yeah, in the examples folder, I'm going to go to my Blazor server there. What I've done now is I've added two more pages in my page. I have a page called Fox Customer and a page called Fox Employees. The Fox Customer page, let's look at it, calls customer get sample. So it gets a sample customer and it retrieves its full name. And the sample customer is defined like you expect. So it has a defined class customer. It doesn't have as custom. I'm explaining that in the paper because if we do it as custom, then we also need to expose the custom class to Blazor, and we don't want to. So this creates a class now that doesn't inherit from customer, which is not what you can do in FoxPro, but in XSharp you can. So in XSharp there's a project property that says for FoxPro that inherit from custom class. I unchecked it on purpose so my classes inherit from object. So there's not the overhead of the custom class where you can also have add properties and have the dynamic properties. This is just a normal class. But we do have the FoxPro syntax for get property. So this is a procedure full name access that returns a property that's read only, and that's it. The other, let's run this and let's look at the other one then. Now I have a problem. That's always the case if you demo. Oh yeah. There's a problem in our project system that when I change some things, it needs to specify that I want to have what we call old style assignments. Your code uses the equal sign to assign, but the equal sign is overloaded. It can also be a comparison. And Christoph showed yesterday that can also be a problem in PHP code where you have single equals, double equals, triple equals. So in our side of the X-based world, we have a colon equals, which is not ambiguous. It's an assignment, period. Or assignment, colon equals, I should say, not period. Um, so, but we do allow you to do it, just like we allow you to use the dot operator. But the dot operator is also overloaded, but it can also be reading the field of a cursor. You understand where I go. So now it does compile. And did I set a breakpoint? No, I didn't. Yeah, I know you're not the default, but you will never be the default. I played a bit with the fonts. That's why it looks terrible here. I thought, but that somehow when you increase the fonts, it starts a word wrap there. It's not what I meant to do. But when I click now, this and this is a bit strange function because you don't have this in FoxPro. I think it's a static function because this is create a method not on the object, but a method on the class. So it's a method that will return an object of type customer. So I'm not exposing the constructor, what they call in, to the outside world, but I'm exposing a method that is basically an object generator. So that's a normal, I would say, approach to expose data. But inside, it's pure the way you are expect in FoxPro. So you see a cursed object, and it has a first name and a last name field, and it has a first full name property. And we will see John Doe. So that's not a surprise. The other page that I added, 5 minutes, I have to hurry. There's way too much to tell about this stuff. Fox, well, the Fox employees razor page itself is similar to what we saw for the fetch data. The code behind uses uses a collection. Tamara did a session about collections. .NET has hundreds of collections. This is what we call a generic collection, a generic list of employee objects. So you know that each element in this collection is always an employee object. Nothing else is allowed. It could be a special derived employee object, but at least everything in there inherits from employee. This now creates an object, not with create object. That's the FoxPro syntax. This shows you how we do it in our XSharp core language. We have the curly braces as an indication that we create a new object. So we also don't use new employee or new list of employee, but we use the curly braces. That's what we inherited from our side of the X-based world. The class is also declared a bit different. It's not defined class, but it uses the what we call core class syntax. So we declare properties, but we can also declare fields in here, which is technically something different from a property. And these are what we call auto properties. So they implement a kind of backing field, and it is automatically a property that you can read and write. So, but you could also have properties like this one that only has a getter. This is a read-only property. Anyway, we get the list here. We use SQL String Connect. We do a SQL exec, and in here we create an employee object again with the same curly brace syntax. And if you look at my errors list, do I have it? No. That's something we'll discover more tomorrow. But we see a warning here because the compiler, unlike what you have with Thor runs in FoxPro, and if you have a DBF open, it knows about a cursor and it knows about the cursor name. The compiler opens no tables at all. And the compiler also doesn't know that the second parameter here is going to create a cursor with the name employees. So what it says, a warning, employees has not been declared, assuming this is a cursor. Now, if it was if we would enable dynamic variables like public and private, it could also be a public, containing an object with the first name field. It doesn't know, but for now it assumes it's a cursor. Anyway, the other syntax is more like the old X-based syntax with the arrow operator. Arrow is not overloaded, so it knows that this must be a field. I could have also done employees.arrow last name. Anyway, this runs. And then in the end, we're going to SQL disconnect. It's try to be smart. Don't keep connections open. In the end, the garbage collector will close them, but this is now being a good Boy Scout and clean up when you leave. Probably we should have a try catch here, so we always disconnect, even if there's an exception. And then in the end, we're calling result, which is a list, and we're returning an array. And there's a technical reason for that. I don't bother you. Let's see if it runs. Go to the browser. It runs. If you read the paper, you go to the steps, then you will see it doesn't run. It doesn't run immediately because we have to change something in the main application. Actually, we have to change a few things. First, the main application runs .NET 6 or 7, I'm not sure what I've chosen. And our library is written in .NET Framework. So with .NET Framework, by default, we have all kinds of components available, like the ODBC library. In the .NET Core app running in Blazor, you need to tell it that we are using ODBC. So you need to explicitly put a reference in there to ODBC to make sure that ODBC is running on the server. The same is true for code pages. ASP.NET Blazor apps can run on Linux. There are no code pages on Linux. So, but if we want to have code page support, and part of the SQL exec stuff deals with translating Unicode strings to ANSI and stuff like that, we need to have code page support. We need to enable that. And on top of that, since the app is running .NET Core, or basically 6 or 7, which is derived from Core, it also does not use the global assembly cache. So that means that if we do not explicitly reference an assembly, then the assembly will not be in the output folder of the project or the solution, and it will not be there. So what I had to do is in this XSharp class library, I had to tell it that we are creating a cursor, and then we need cursor support in this assembly. And to do that, I added a reference to a component from XSharp that supports the cursors, and we call it RDDs. So I have added a reference there, and to add that up, I added up everything up together. Then this was working. So if you will do this for the first time, you will have these problems. Finally, last seconds, I said I was running .NET Framework in my XSharp application, but the main app is .NET 6 or 7. I'm not sure what I've chosen. It's not framework. So you may wonder, does that work? Well, yeah, as you see, it does work because the way it works is that the main app, in this case the server app, chooses the environment where it runs in the assembly, in this case the Sharp FoxPro assembly, gets loaded in that environment. And the binary format of the assemblies is the same. So the main app runs in .NET 6 or 7, and as long as we do not do something that's not supported in .NET 6 or 7, it will work. For example, what's not supported is accessing the Windows registry, because that won't work. Or you need to do something special, like I said, to support ODBC. So if you tell the main app what's needed, then it will run, otherwise not. But normal stuff like strings, date types, etc., that's all of the same in all frameworks. It's technically the same, but I would say on .NET 6.7 it's a bit faster. They've optimized the code, but your .NET 4 stuff runs without problems in an environment where the environment was started up in .NET 6 or 7 mode. Now, I think I have everything on the slides. Yeah, what I didn't mention is that there's also a new Blazor hybrid, which allows you to put MAUI controls inside native Android tabs. But my Android machine was not really playing along, so we didn't even get to see that. And I put this in the notes too. There's many resources online about Blazor. I think Carl Franklin did about 100 videos online. They look a bit childish because Blazor train, he makes the reference to the train and he has a conductor pad on in all the movements. But the content is great. But it looks a bit, silly. But listen to what he says and don't look at his conductor's head. C# Fridge has a lot, and there's many others. And I'm repeating myself, I'm not a web UI specialist. And you can probably divide that work in your company too. We've shown this, we've shown that. And you need to add packages. I mentioned that. Okay. Are there any questions? And we can probably silently go over into the Q&A, but maybe we need to switch to the other window then.
Yes, we'll need to do that.
But are there any?
Nothing at the moment.
Okay, let's switch to the other window, and then we'll do the Q&A afterwards. And if you're bored, you can go out and have a drink or something, whatever you want. Don't feel you don't insult me when you leave. But we'll switch over, and this session then we go to the Q&A mode. Thanks a lot. I hope you learned something from this. I learned a lot when writing this, and I ended up with 40 pages almost description. So there was more to say about it than fits in an hour and a quarter. Read it, and if you have questions, you know where to find me.
Thank you.